December 20th, 2010 was when I was told that I had cancer.
I was diagnosed with something called a medulloblastoma.
I was diagnosed with stage 3 rectal cancer.
I'm also a breast cancer survivor of a little over a year now.
I always wanted to have a child. I just didn't want to give that part of life up.
Fertility can very much be affected by chemotherapy, and the fact that women often after chemotherapy will go through menopause earlier. These are things that the general public I don't think is aware of.
I have a fertile issue, that I'm a young adult, I'm in my fertile years, I may not be married, I may not have a girlfriend, but
I always wanted kids. So I think the majority of people go through life thinking, when I'm a grown-up, I'm gonna get married and have kids.
That's what we're living for, is to have a family one day.
So oncofertility is a word that seems so logical now. It's hard to imagine that it wasn't at one time. I really felt like we needed a way to make sure everybody understood that we weren't just talking about cancer patients and some distant fertility need, but really fertility needs in the context of a diagnosis that for a young person is really the biggest existential crisis you can imagine. Each of the projects on the grant, I'm still so impressed with how well they resonate with where we've actually gone.
For us to work together the way we have, it's probably been one of the smoothest and most, pleasing experiences I've had. This group of investigators are quite extraordinary.
The collegiality that you see from all aspects, from the basic science standpoint, where we start through the clinical science, through the information transfer, and even into the outreach programs, it's just been phenomenal.
It became an interesting community-wide discussion. And that's because with that kind of crosstalk and that kind of excitement from lots of different disciplines, we're able to say, this is what science looks like.
Everything was just so fast. I wouldn't have thought about the fertility preservation if it weren't for my nurse practitioner who brought it up. It wasn't something that I was, how would I know? That's not something you think about when you're like, oh no, I have cancer, I could die, this is really advanced.
It's been remarkable, the amount of new knowledge we have on the fundamentals of how the ovary works.
So I think we've made more progress in understanding follicular development in primates in the last 4 years than they've probably made in the previous 30.
Lonnie Shea and his group have really done an extraordinary job of developing artificial ovaries, basically, that allow the individual follicle to be able to grow outside its normal environment.
It's not just growing cells individually, but having these cells work together as a unit to actually form functional tissues. And typical cell culture is just done on plastic surfaces, and the cells lose their normal architecture. And by providing a material, we can actually support them, allow them to maintain their normal architecture that allows for that coordinated growth over time.
If you would have asked 6 years ago, could you take an immature follicle with an egg and grow it to full maturity? And people, they would have scratched their heads saying, you gotta be crazy. But for Lonnie Shea and his suggestion, maybe you ought to use a three-dimensional gel instead of a petri dish, that was novel, it was critical, pivotal.
One of the things that reproductive science really needs is extraordinary partnership in non-human primate models. And Dick Stauffer is one of the most extraordinary follicle biologists on the planet. And he has been able to take monkey follicles and been able to coax them to the point where he now has a few embryos.
As we develop and optimize this in a primate model, that it will be more directly relevant to what can be applied to the human ovary.
We are focused particularly on patients that may have hematological malignancies. So we are dissecting follicles out of frozen thawed tissue, growing them in three-dimensional culture to obtain an egg that's healthy, that can fertilize, and someday result in a healthy offspring.
The transplant work, I think, really has tremendous potential based on what's happened already clinically.
To date, there are about 15 live human births from frozen thawed ovarian tissue.
Now, the holy grail is being able to start with the primordial follicles, and going from a primordial or a primary follicle all the way up to a mature fertilizable egg in vitro it's a big challenge. But it's also, because of technologies and the team of people that are available, I think it's an attainable goal.
We said there's no way we can make as many advances as we wish to make on the timeline that we wish to make if we wait to read each other's papers in the journal 2 or 3 years from now. And so we said what we're going to do is somewhat unorthodox. We're all going to share our data in a virtual lab meeting in real time. The pace has been accelerated and the quality has been immeasurably changed.
And we can say that all the virtual doors are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I think the virtual Grand Rounds meeting have really bridged the gap between clinical work and basic science research and really allowed a conversation to happen between those two realms, which often don't have the opportunity to talk. It really has helped to inform the basic science, and even the basic science is helping to inform clinical practice.
I don't know if I would have come to think, oh, maybe I should explore some fertility preservation options. I probably would have just went straight into chemo.
I didn't know much about chemotherapy, and I didn't even think about how it would affect her fertility because she's so young. I didn't think it would. So if they wouldn't have mentioned that as an option, I don't know if we would have even known to do it.
I think one of the things when you build a new medical discipline is oftentimes you're really putting your foot into an area where there's a well-honed pattern of how things get done.
Part of the enjoyment in developing this clinical program was the fact that it was hard.
A surprisingly low number of pediatric oncologists were familiar with these recommendations for fertility preservation measures. And furthermore, even lower numbers were actually using these recommendations in their day-to-day care.
Most of us have been practicing medicine a certain way. We have a certain approach to the patients when they come in, specifically our young patients, that is very well worn.
They worry that the families might, to some degree, think that they're taking their eye off of the ball if they start talking about anything but survival.
Families actually want this information, and patients want this information. I really think that it's all about facilitating the process for the patients and families and having open discussions.
The fact that their doctor is thinking ahead about the long term shows them that their doctor cares and is invested in their long term and thinks that there is a future for them.
We needed to have a cohort of institutions or clinics that would be willing to participate in what we had termed the National Physicians Cooperative.
We started with about 5 centers, and now we're up to something like 66 of these centers that are distributed across the nation.
Most of our calls, 70% or so, are for female cancer patients, but there's a good 30% that are for young male patients.
There is no other organization that allows for patients and physicians to call in and to integrate and coordinate the questions, issues.
It's a really compelling example of having a national resource and having folks that are familiar with protocols in oncofertility around the country and being able to refer patients appropriately.
The key individual that makes all of this work is our patient navigator.
I'm a patient advocate. I'm essentially the shepherd between all the different medical specialties. I can come in for a consult right on the day of diagnosis, actually.
We started with a patient website, myoncofertility.org.
We have an iPhone app, I Save Fertility. It's a free downloadable app that patients or providers can download. And I also help answer the national hotline so that I can help triage patients from all over the country.
Getting the information distributed as broadly as possible is so critical to the mission. So I think those are 3 innovative things that we've done that I hope will be sustained and provide the option for more patients to access needed services for their fertility.
It gave me control in a situation that was completely out of my control. I just know that it was such a hopeful experience for me, and I just think that that could markedly change how a survivor actually fights their fight.
Very few other science projects that I've been involved in as an ethicist have said part of our responsibility is to women of color, is to underserved minorities, and to bring them into this process.
We have a program called the Oncofertility National Science Education Network. And this network is a group of universities around the nation that teach a curriculum that we built called the Oncofertility Saturday Academy. So the idea is to use the Oncofertility curriculum to educate the next generation of not only potential scientists and doctors, but also leaders, those who can understand something about their own biology in an empowering way.
These students are just amazing. They just soak up all of what you have to tell them, and they're just really excited about learning.
I had no opportunities like this when I was trying to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I really think it's important to be a role model for young women.
You know, see the exit interviews where they say, I want to be a chemical engineer, or I want to be a biomedical engineer, and the idea that you might be inspiring them to do something that they'd never considered before.
One of the other education programs we've built is called the Repropedia. We wanted to create a definition pool that would provide a place that had authoritative information, but in a digestible way. We also educate the community of scientists. We've hooked up cameras to all of our microscopes. We've put it into a web-based system that people around the globe can participate in the experiments that we're doing. We think that kind of education module, again, is very paradigm changing, because we're not used to giving away all of the tools or the secrets of the trade. But in fact, we think that's in the best interest of the science, and it's in the best interest of solving the problem.
The fact that we're even having this conversation today is progress. It's a conversation that was not even on the radar 3 to 5 years ago. And here it is today, a prominent talking point in the entire healthcare conversation.
It was very clear to me, even before we had the first technological breakthrough, we really needed to engage all the disciplines of the social sciences and the humanities, and in particular bioethics, religion, and the law.
This opens up a whole novel area of the meaning of reproductive freedom, a sort of vested interest in reproduction that's not going to take place for years to come.
Our idea here was to come in at the very beginning of the project and help the scientists think through the nature of the ethical problems that they confront at a very basic level, in the same way they confronted basic science.
It was, in fact, Lori and one of her humanist groups who said, you're really just focused on the biological side of the equation. Who's talking about the non-biological side?
Some researchers are finding that it's difficult for cancer survivors to adopt.
It led us to some activist interventions, calling up these adoption agencies and saying, what is your policy?
And so that issue of access to adoption then gets related to the issue of access to oncofertility.
We have a list of adoptive services who have agreed to not make it a high hurdle for young women who have had a cancer diagnosis to adopt a child. And that is a big paradigm shift in the adoption world.
Once they told me that I had come back to my lungs, I knew my time was limited. There's nothing more optimistic than having a baby come along.
We're just grateful for Kristen and the people who said, wait a minute, you should think about this before you undergo your chemo. You should think about the fertility preservation. And knowing that Dan did that for us, I mean, that's amazing, and I can't wait to share that with our daughter someday and let her know everything her dad did for her.
We're breaking through these old practice patterns and making the issue of oncofertility a more accepted and expected part of how a young patient's care is going to be pursued.
If we could figure out when we see a newly diagnosed patient, what is her risk of actually having a problem?
Making sure that we are just looking at everybody as an equal comer, perhaps not looking at someone's age, for instance, as being something that might exclude them.
And how do we provide a greater range of options for these patients that are potentially less invasive and less expensive?
Well, we'd like to see this grow. We think that we haven't completed the network. We think there are regions in the United States that are really devoid of knowledge, of clinics, of the expertise that's required to serve this particular population.
So we need to train the next generation of clinicians and research scientists to continue to make the advances. And this is not something where you would like to just see sort of a shooting star which falls through the sky and then disappears, but rather more of an early morning sunrise that shows you the many opportunities that can develop over the next 24 hours, or in our case, maybe 20 years.
Right now that I'm past all of this treatment, I feel very positive that I'm going to be around for a while.
It gave me tremendous hope during a period that was quite dark, quite scary. And it also, to think about what life looks like after cancer helped fuel my fight. I just feel so incredibly grateful for everything that they're doing.
The fact that this program exists in the first place, if we wouldn't be having this baby if it didn't. It was just really good to get the age-appropriate attention I needed. I've definitely made the right decision.
The science, the education, the outreach, just the brand, it's making a huge difference every day.
It's hard to find a better example than the story of Oncofertility in terms of what defines success on all levels. We really were able to live the dream through this experience.
If we simply create and contain, we will never succeed. If we create and give away, we will all rise.
You create a house, and the house is a house in which there's rooms of science and rooms of humanities, and there's big hallways and interconnection and places for coffee. And you make sure your house is sturdy, and that in each room, people are doing research and writing away, but that they come together and it's open to the public, and you have a house of discourse.
I think in the end, it is just a valuable, tangible output of the science being translated into a way that's enduring.